and time. Let me quickly introduce Professor Felix. Felix Oberholzer-Gee is an Andreas Anderson Professor of Business Administration and the head of the strategy unit at Harvard Business School. He has been a member of the faculty since 2003 and received both his master's degree and his PhD in economics from the University of Zurich. He currently teaches competitive strategy in the executive education programs at HBS, and his course on strategy beyond the market is a popular elective class in the second year MBA. Professor Felix has received numerous awards for teaching excellence and has written several books and dozens of journal articles on strategy. His most recent book, Better, Simpler Strategy, a value-based guide to exceptional performance, is the subject of today's presentation. So with that, let me pass it over to you, Felix.
Thank you very much, Lucas, for the kind introduction, and Guillermo for the invitation to speak here. I'm delighted to have a little bit of time with you to talk about strategic decision making, to talk about this latest book. So I will share some ideas with you, but of course, if you have questions, if you have examples, I'd be more than happy to interrupt the presentation and take questions as we go along. And then, as Lucas has pointed out, we made some time at the end of the hour that we have for everyone to do some Q&A. But I will get started explaining the basic idea. And I wanted to share a little bit a behind the scenes look with you of how I came to write this book and what I learned in the process of writing it. So the first message or note that I wanted to share with you is, if you're thinking about the potential of your company to be much more successful, say you have doing pretty well, you have a good return on invested capital, like what are the chances that you could be, I don't know, 10% more successful, 20% more successful? You should be super optimistic that that's actually possible. And as you maybe can tell, I'm an optimistic person myself, but actually this has nothing to do with my personal optimism. This just comes from the data that I looked at when I wrote this book. Here's some data for the United States. So large companies, S&P 500, it's a long period of time. I'm interested in financial performance, not a few quarters or you had a really great year. Like, what are differences over long periods of time? And you have return on invested capital on the horizontal axis, and then just a number of firms that achieve a particular return. And what I would like you to focus on is just the tremendous differences in performance. Right? If you look at these companies, you think, oh, these are all household names. These are all famous companies. If you're included in the S&P 500, you have made it. And yet, among these companies, the differences in performance are just astounding. And this is not a US phenomenon. If you look across different geographies, look at Brazil, look at China, India, South Korea, every country that I've looked at in the process of doing this research, I see exactly the same picture. I see these really amazing performance differences. And now, of course, you're thinking, well, if we look at Brazil, or if you look at China, or if we looked at Colombia, the makeup of these economies is, of course, very different, right? So some of these economies have big manufacturing sectors. Some of these economies have big financial sectors. And so that might be driving some of these differences. But actually, maybe from a strategy perspective, if you drill down a little bit and look at a particular industry, so this is just one example of hundreds that I looked at, US insurance, you see two things. It is true that the mean changes quite a bit, right? So insurance in the United States is a tough business to be in. It's not that easy to be profitable, but we get the same thing back. We get these really amazing performance differences. And the same is true if we don't break it down by geography, if we break it down by particular industries. So I'm showing you lots of different industries here. The left-hand whisker is the 10th percentile in the distribution of return on invested capital. The right-hand whisker is the 90th percentile of the return of the distribution of return on invested capital. And you just should take away with very few exceptions. If you're a utility, yes, of course, you're regulated, you're given prices, there isn't really much variation. But for everyone else, it is just astounding how much better you can be. And now to give you some intuition, let me give you a practical example. Say we took 100 companies and we ranked them from the best performing number 1 to the worst performing number 100. And say your company is exactly average. So you're not a superstar company today. You're ranked 50. And I move you up by 10 ranks, not asking for the impossible, just from rank 50 to rank 40. What would happen to your return on invested capital? The answer is it would increase by 25%. Isn't that amazing? Just like some deviation from the average gives you like this really amazing improvement in performance. And so that's my first message to you this evening. When you're thinking about performance, like think that I have so much runway. I have so much opportunity to do better than I do today. That is true for 99% of all companies. And then, of course, you know, the next natural question is, okay, so there's a lot of possibility. Like, how do you actually do it? And that's maybe the part that surprised me most when I did the research for the book. I expected the very best companies to do very sophisticated things, very complicated things. And, you know, it's like how we sometimes think about strategy. It's like difficult. It's like you have to have a lot of experience. You have to be older, maybe a board member, wrinkles, gray hair, all the rest of it. And what I found was actually completely different. Essentially, the companies that do well, they do something really simple. They either increase willingness to pay for their customers, or they decrease willingness to sell for their employees or for their suppliers. Done. There's nothing else. I have desperately looked for exceptions where I see some company that is really doing well, that is doing something different. And I was like, if you have an example, I would be all ears. I think this is basically it. Strategy is not complicated. Strategy is all about how do I increase the willingness to pay of my customers? So willingness to pay is the most a customer would ever be willing to pay. I charge the customer $1 more and the customer is better off not buying. And you have a lot of intuition about willingness to pay. Willingness to sell is the concept in the book that I think is least intuitive, that needs a little bit of explanation. And let me give you an example first of willingness to sell for an employee. Think of a friend of yours who works for some other company, not for your organization, some other company, and you would like the friend to join your organization. And you know, you're writing the offer letter, trying to move him to your company. What's the lowest compensation that you could offer and your friend would still come? That's this friend's willingness to sell. Of course, if the job is an amazing job, the job that the friend always wanted to have, willingness to sell is going to be low because you don't have to offer that much money for my dream job. If the job is maybe a little boring, if the job is dangerous, like personal risk, oh, of course, willingness to sell goes up. And so what the most successful companies do is they increase willingness to pay, the maximum that customers want to pay, and they decrease willingness to sell, that lowest level of compensation that is required to lure someone to your company. Now, of course, this doesn't mean we're not charging customers their willingness to pay, and we're not paying employees their willingness to sell. That has to do with competition and how we think about growth and margins and all the rest of it. But that's essentially where profitability comes from. So the interesting thing is, if you want better profitability, you actually don't start with thinking about profits. You start with thinking about how do I create more value? How do I create more value for my customers by increasing their willingness to pay? How do I create more value for my employees by decreasing their willingness to sell? That's the recipe for success. That's where good performance comes from. So you think so much, I don't know about you, but when I'm in board meetings and I talk to companies, so much when we talk about strategies, all about, oh, how can you improve financial performance? And like in a strange ways, yes, of course, that's the goal, but that's not how you do it. You start by thinking about ways to create additional value for customers and employees. And so this is the basic premise of the book. And what I wanted to share with you this afternoon is basically just talking a little bit about what did I learn as I looked into all of these companies that are essentially doing one of these two things. And it's a little bit behind the scenes, if you will, some stories that often, I hope, shed light on something really interesting. So the first example, the first story that I wanted to tell you is the story of Best Buy. And you probably know, this is, if you look at the last decade, and if you look around turnaround stories, that's got to be one of the most amazing stories in the last decade or so. You remember about 10 years ago, Best Buy lost $1 billion a quarter. Everybody, including myself, I thought it's just a question of time until they go out of business. Because you remember, Circuit City went out of business. Basically, Amazon pushed all of these guys out of business. And so everybody thought, well, you know, it's like, okay, so Best Buy is hanging on a little bit, but of course they're going to go out of business. Today, they have a return on invested capital of 25%. So how did they do this? The amazing thing is, it's not 1,000 things. It's just really two big ideas. The first one is, instead of building big warehouses, big distribution centers, they started thinking of every store as a distribution center. So if you order something from Best Buy today, in all likelihood, it doesn't get shipped from one of their big distribution centers. It gets shipped from a store. And because they have 1,000 stores, stores are where people are, they now beat Amazon at shipping times. They raised willingness to pay by being faster than anyone if you wanted your products tomorrow. And because all of these stores are so close to where people live, many people actually choose to just pick up what they have, and they go to the store and, you know, they pick up extra product, which is really nice. So one idea was we increase willingness to pay by having faster shipping. The second idea was everybody looked at Apple and how they spend millions of dollars on furbishing these beautiful stores. And Best Buy essentially went to Microsoft and went to Sony and went to Samsung and said, we offer you something that gives you more foot traffic at a fraction of the cost. Build a store within our stores. And so today, when you visit a Best Buy store, it's basically like a little department store. It has all of these different sections with the different vendors. That is a fraction of the price of what you would spend on if you built a freestanding store. And then you'd worry about whether actually consumers would come. At Best Buy, because everybody goes, that's not really a question. So what did they do? They lowered the willingness to sell of their suppliers. And because now people work for dedicated brands, this is a much more interesting job. I actually know the products. I actually love the brand that I'm selling. And they lower the willingness to sell of their employees. They have amazing employee engagement. Churn is way down. That's what I found across dozens and dozens of examples. The companies that succeed are not the companies that do a million things. The companies that succeed, they pursue a few projects that change willingness to pay, change willingness to sell in a really amazing fundamental fashion. So here's my first piece of advice for you. When you go back to the office tomorrow morning, like look at the stack of projects on your desk, all these initiatives, all these activities. For each one of them, ask, is it really true that this thing changes willingness to pay? Is it really true that this thing changes willingness to sell? And if the answer is no, or if you're not so sure, don't do it. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of time. You cannot afford to do all of these things that ultimately don't have an amazing impact on willingness to pay and willingness to sell. I'm not sure what your impression is, but when I write a lot of cases, so I visit many companies and I work with lots of companies, my sense is sometimes everybody's working so hard. There's like a million things going on in every organization that I visit. And it's really amazing because, you don't have unlimited budgets. People are hard to find. It's not so easy to hire. And for many of these projects, I just cannot imagine how they change willingness to pay or how they change willingness to sell. For doing all of these things that have no chance of ever being translated into financial success. My colleague, Francis, I think has a very good description: exhausted mediocrity. We're doing so many things, we're working so hard, we feel exhausted, and at the same time, we don't have amazing results to show. Why is that? Oh, because we're not focusing on a few things that make all the difference. Let me give you some other example. This is Nokia in 2007, the leading mobile phone company. Like if you look at that product portfolio, like really amazing. Like if if you don't find your dream phone in this portfolio, I don't know exactly what to think of you. They had a phone for everyone. Everybody loved Nokia. And then, as you know, things fell apart like super, super fast. Why? And this guy just had a single product. Don't do a million things. Don't pursue 50,000 projects. Do the one thing that really changes willingness to pay. The one thing that really changes willingness to sell. Think about Google. 65% of Google's profitability comes from that first idea about search. Isn't this amazing? They're doing a million things, but basically it's that one idea that makes all the difference. So I found this to be true time after time after time. Second advice that I saw, which I thought was very interesting, is the most successful companies, they often compete on selection. Let me give you a few examples that indicate what I mean. Discovery, you probably know, is a life insurance company out of South Africa. And one of the interesting things that they do is they partner with supermarkets and they provide access to healthy foods at really discounted prices. The discounts are typically 50% or so, sometimes up to 70, 75%. And so now you're wondering, like, why would a health insurance company provide access to healthy foods at low prices? And of course, everybody's thinking about the direct effect, right? So if it's really true that if you have better eating habits, then of course you're going to lead a healthier life. It's cheaper to insure you. That's a cost advantage for the company. And that's sort of typical how we think about changes in willingness to pay. We think about the immediate benefit to the customer, or changes in willingness to sell. We think about the immediate benefit to the employee. But what's equally important is the selection effect. Think about who finds the notion of cheap but healthy food particularly attractive. Of course, health-conscious people, people who are healthy to begin with. If you're a health insurance company, that's your dream customer because so cheap to insure. They're very unlikely to be sick in the next decade or so. And so I always want you to think about these two things. Think about how can I create value for my customers? And that's a good thing. But then also think about who will find this value proposition particularly attractive? Who do I select to serve? And the most successful company, sometimes it almost feels a little bit like cheating. You get to serve the customer who exactly like what you have, because that's why they chose you in the first place. If you look at Uber, the ride-sharing company, and you compare Uber to a taxi company in the United States, you will see that Uber has twice as many women drivers as men. They essentially doubled the driver pool with their business model. How did they do this? Oh, they offer two things: better safety, because we know who the passenger is, and great flexibility. For whom is safety and flexibility really important? Women. And so again, the main advantage here, of course, it's nice that the people who work for Uber, that they have really flexible hours and that they feel safer. But the key competitive advantage here is you compete on selection. You get the right kind of customer, or in Uber's case, you get the right kind of person to work for you. This is what is going on at Apple these days. So these are gross margins from 2010 to 2019. You see in hardware, in the phone in particular, they declined about 20% or so, 20-25%. And then margins in the App Store go way up. Why do you think that is? Like, what is happening? What's the story here? Don't be shy.
A lot of things to select on the App Store.
Yeah. So the selection in the App Store is pretty amazing, right? If you go to the App Store and you don't find something that's entertaining and funny, I'm not sure what's wrong with you. Yes. So there's the App Store definitely appealing. Why else let me look at this? I have to say, like, you go back to, I don't know, 2012, 2014, the App Store was pretty amazing back then. Had lots and lots of interesting apps. What is happening? So we see the effect of competition. The iPhone, of course, was super extra special, unrivaled when it was first released. These days, not so much, right? If you want better cameras, you probably have a Xiaomi phone. If you want better integration with apps, you probably have a Samsung phone or a Huawei phone. Apple has essentially lost its competitive edge in hardware. Now, hardware and software, as you might remember, are complements, right? If the price of the complement goes down, willingness to pay for the other product goes up. So what are they doing? In the beginning, they keep apps super cheap and they raise willingness to pay for hardware. And it was amazing margins for the iPhone. And now they do the reverse. They shift their profit pool. They're taking prices for the hardware down and they're shifting the profit pool to software, because that's where they have less competition. And I don't know if you're following the famous lawsuit. The court proceedings take place now. Apple against the game company, haggling over whether they should really pay 30% of their app price. That has to do with the shifted profit pools. And I've seen this time and time again. The best companies, they have both their core product and they have complements. Other products, other services that increase the willingness to pay of their core product. And one benefit is, of course, that you get to sell both things, but the bigger benefit is that you get to shift profit pools in response to competitive intensity across the two products. If you look at any one of the big groups, look at Alibaba. Why is Alibaba in all of these businesses? Yes, I understand it's an e-commerce company, but then there's AliExpress, there's Alipay, there's Aliyun, there's all of these businesses. And when you look at it, they're all complements to the core e-commerce business. And why is it this amazing advantage that is so hard to compete against? Oh, because they're shifting profit pools. If they have a big new competitor in freight tomorrow, they just shift the profit pool to some other business. If you looked at Amazon, it's exactly the same play. All of these different profit pools, and we're shifting profits in response. And so one idea that I think is really prominent and that plays a big role in the book is you have to be super serious at discovering complements for your products. Sometimes we get so used to the existence of compliments that it's even hard for us to see. But the example that I often use is, think of your willingness to pay for a car. I don't know, $30,000, $50,000, whatever. And now think about, what if we didn't have compliments for the car? What if we didn't have roads? What if we didn't have gas stations? What if we didn't have repair shops? What if we didn't have GPS? What if your willingness to pay for the car will basically go away? And that's generally true. Every product that you can think of, it's the willingness to pay for that product depends critically on compliments. And so for your product, for your service, the question is, what are these compliments? And do you have interesting ways then to start shifting the profit pools? Fourth, and you might remember, those of you who took business school classes, you might remember this. There was this phrase in strategy that was very prominent, stuck in the middle. Do you remember that? And the idea was, if you're trying to have an advantage with your customers, higher willingness to pay, and at the same time, you're trying to have a cost advantage, that's not a story that has a good ending. You were said to be stuck in the middle. In essence, strategy 101, the first 5 minutes, what you have to do is you have to decide, am I going to have an advantage in willingness to pay, or will I have an advantage in willingness to sell and cost? And if you don't make up your mind, it has a terrible ending. And that is no longer true. I think the intuition for this advice came from manufacturing, where in order to produce a better product, you need to have better inputs, and better inputs are more costly. And so you couldn't really have higher willingness to pay and lower costs at the same time. But these days, of course, the vast majority of what we do is services. Have you ever seen a company that doesn't have an engaged workforce and great service? No, it doesn't exist. And so company after company after company that I saw, they have an advantage in willingness to sell on the cost side, working with employees, working with suppliers, and they have an advantage in willingness to pay. And let me give you a practical example. This is the story of Roxul. Roxul is a company, a Japanese company that is a B2B service in the printing industry. So Roxul in the beginning is basically a website. If I have a printing job, I go to the website, I see all the print jobs in Japan, and I choose someone I want to select for the job that I have. And that works pretty well. So lots of businesses go to Roxul and they choose their printing shops. There's there's 30,000 printing shops or something like this in Japan. And then Roxul has this idea, oh, maybe we can do a better job. Maybe we can create more value if we pair the businesses that have a particular print job with the companies that have exactly the right equipment. Logically, costs go down if you print something on the right equipment. And because it's going to be high quality, you get higher willingness to pay. And then they're thinking, oh, what if we pair these businesses with companies that have the right equipment, but actually low utilization? Oh, costs are even lower because the opportunity cost of not using that, the machine stands idle if you don't use it. Opportunity cost super low. So now they're pairing high quality print outputs with really low willingness to sell. And then they start hiring Toyota engineers who know about continuous improvement. They send these engineers to the print shops and they help them optimize their production processes. What's the net result? You have amazing willingness to pay because you get really high printing quality. You have the lowest cost imaginable because we're printing on the right equipment that would have stood idle and that is optimized by these process engineers. So the suppliers, the print shops, get pretty attractive prices because they have such low costs. The customers have high quality and moderate prices because the costs are so low. And Roxul is financially super, super successful. They create dual advantages. They have an advantage in willingness to pay. They have an advantage in willingness to sell. That is true of Zara, the fashion house. That is true of Intel. That is true of Quest Diagnostics, the diagnostics company that plays a big role in COVID. So many companies have dual advantages, and I want you to aspire to do the same. It's no longer you're going to be stuck in the middle. It's in fact, you're leaving out a really big opportunity if you don't aspire to dual advantages. All right, second to the last thing I learned. Once you have a say how you want to get a particular increase in willingness to pay, or how you want to decrease willingness to sell, it's really important to ask, how exactly does this work? So one practical example, you go to law firms and they all tell you they want to be more profitable, they want to be more successful by doing two things. They want to grow really aggressively, and they want to build a global presence. Everyone you talk to in legal services says, oh, key to success is we got to grow and we have to be global. And you know, from the airport bookstore, I mean, now you haven't flown in a little while, but if you go back to the airport bookstores, there's all of these business books with these recipes of what you need to do. And, you know, scale up or build a valuable brand. And for the book, I've looked at many of these recipes, and I looked at the recipe for law firms. You got to be really big and you got to be really global, and then you'll be really successful. And always when I look at these recipes, here's basically what I see. It works beautiful for some companies. Like if you look at Jones Day, yeah, they're really big, they're really global, they have amazing profit margins. But then look at Quinn Emanuel. They're tiny by comparison. They're not particularly global, and they're even more successful. So how is such an important question? Say someone comes to you and with an idea. You're really going to ask three questions. The first question is, does it increase willingness to pay? Does it decrease willingness to sell? The second question is, what's the selection effect? If we increase willingness to pay in this particular fashion, who's going to be particularly attracted to our firm? And then the third question that you're going to ask is, and how does this exactly work? How is it going to be true that if we do this, we will have a long-lasting competitive advantage? And here, of course, the answer that people will give is, oh, there's economies of scale, there's fixed costs in legal services. But it turns out these fixed costs are not that important. And as a result, even if you're a mid-sized law firm, you reach scale easily. There's no need for you to grow. And in fact, if you do grow, nothing happens to your margin because you spread fixed costs across so many matters. Let me give you a second example. This is in the luxury segment, and it's two handbags by Gucci. And you see the handbag on the right-hand side has this like big emblem. You know, you look at it, everybody knows this is a Gucci handbag. On the left-hand side, interestingly, it's a Gucci handbag, but it's hard to see. Like you don't have a big logo or anything. Which of these two do you think is more expensive? Lucas, do you have a sense? If you had to get, you have a 50% chance of getting it right.
I'll go with the one with the G.
No, I go to the other one.
The one with the someone that like the logo, it's a big brand. Oh, and Ariel doesn't agree with us. But you would think first, like it's a really big brand. As a result, it's got to be the one that has the big logo that is going to be more successful. And then, of course, you look at the prices, and here's what you see.
Wow.
Okay. Ariel, why is this? Why is the one on the left the more expensive one?
Well, I would say people that buy these brands, they don't like these big names all over the place of the product. They like more like minimalistic kind of approach, because if you have a product with that has like Gucci, saying Gucci all over the place, it will be, you know, poor taste. It will be actually quite the opposite of what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes, that's exactly right. If you're that rich, if you're spending $30,000 on a handbag, you don't have to advertise the fact that you're rich. And interestingly, people will write, the really rich, affluent people, they will recognize each other, right? So if you're in the group, you know these are the Gucci colors. People tell me, I couldn't tell, but people tell me you recognize the shine of crocodile leather. And so there's no need to advertise. And in fact, if you're really rich, you don't want to advertise the fact that you spend $30,000 on a handbag. And by the way, it's interesting, it's also true for Mercedes, the car. The more expensive the Mercedes, the smaller the star on the hood. So if you buy the cheapest model, the star is like really big. And then as the model becomes more expensive, like, oh, smaller and smaller and smaller. And there are some really expensive ones that don't have the star at all. So this is why it's so important to ask this how question, right? Because it's a good idea to say, oh, I can lift willingness to pay with the help of a brand. And in some detail, how does that exactly work? Just the way Ariel explained. How is it among the very affluent that I can use my brand in order to raise willingness to pay? And the answer, a little counterintuitive, is you do it by hiding. You do it by hiding the. All right, the last thing that I made is about lowering willingness to sell. But then, of course, willingness to pay and willingness to sell are too abstract a concept for you to know, now, what do I do Monday morning when I'm back in the office? And so the last third of the book or so is about implementation. And I describe in some details one of the tools that, in my experience, is probably the single most useful, helpful, powerful tool in all of strategy. And it's what's called a value map. Here's an example of a value map. On the vertical side, you have what's called a value driver. That is, what are the components of willingness to pay? When I ask you, what are the kinds of things that would really increase your willingness to pay? This is for a retail bank and for a particular segment of customers. And for them, an excellent mobile app is more important than anything else. So these value drivers are ordered in the order from most important to least important. And then on the horizontal, you indicate the level of performance. Some companies do it from 1 to 5. Some companies do it from 1 to 10. This company here did it as the difference between the market average and how well the company does it. And you do it for your own organization, and you do it for your competitors. I promise you, if you do this with your teams, I think it's the best time spent and the most insightful exercise that you can do to evolve your strategy. Because, for instance, here, they know that, oh, an excellent mobile app, this is for premium customers, is like super important for these premium customers. As a result, so much of their R&D goes into having one of the leading apps. They win all of these prizes because they have one of the best banking apps. And of course, you can do this exact same thing also on the willingness to sell side for employees. So what is the most important criteria? Here in this particular sample, for these kinds of people who would consider being bank tellers, a company that promotes innovative thinking. Second most important, salary and benefits. Third most important, flexible work environment, and so on and so on. And you notice, like if we go back on the customer side, this bank has a big competitive advantage. There's just really no one that comes close. But on the employee side, they have very powerful competitors. In fact, they don't stand out. People rather work for Amazon than they work for Tatra Bank. If you're interested in this exercise, I have instructions that I'm happy to share with everyone. It's an amazing exercise to build your strategy on. So 6 things I learned. The first 2, I think, are sort of the big messages. Be optimistic about performance improvements, and always remember, strategy is not complicated. If you meet a consultant, if you meet a board member who tries to make strategy sound super complicated, don't believe it. Like if it's a consultant, it's probably just going to sell you stuff. Oh yeah, you need like 1 million hours of service before you begin to understand. No, it's very simple. It's we increase willingness to pay, we decrease willingness. And then a few practical pieces of advice. I'm guessing you're all doing way too many projects, way too many initiatives. Think about who you would attract if you increase willingness to pay or decrease willingness to sell in a particular fashion. So important to think about complements. Your aspiration should be for dual advantages. You want to stand out at both ends of the value stick. Asking how exactly is this particular idea going to increase willingness to pay or decrease willingness to sell? And then using these maps to visualize how you build your strategy. Those are essentially the things that I think really set apart the companies that are super successful from anyone else. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
This is great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Felix. So insightful around, just simplifying strategy and sharpening strategic thinking. So I guess I'll kick it off with an initial question and see if anyone has some more. And how does this differ from like the more traditional strategy approaches that we've been used to? Like, what are the main differences versus traditional strategy?
Yeah. So there's two things really that I would like to emphasize. The first one is in traditional strategy, you paid most attention to playing in the right segments. Do you remember this book that was a big hit that recently came out, Where to Play, How to Win? It wasn't a coincidence that it was this order, right? Where to play was seen as most important. And then, once you play in the right segments, you can ask like, how do I actually win? Which is very similar to this value-based approach. But my data show where to play is actually not that important because there's so much variation in profitability where you are today. So the idea, like I compared, say you get 10% better in your segment, or you pick a segment, a different part of the industry or a different country that is 10% better than where you are today. What's the more profitable move? Staying in your segment and trying to deepen your competitive advantage, so much more profitable. So that's a first difference that I think, yes, of course, it's true that if you remember like the crazy chart that I showed you with all these bars, the average changes, but these changes in averages are not nearly as important as the runway that you have within your own industry. And the second thing is this stuck in the middle business. That's the traditional strategists will tell you the first thing that you have to decide is, do you want to have a premium product or do you want to be a cost leader? And everything builds from there. And I find that's just advice that was good advice in the past, maybe. I don't even know, really, because this has been long before I started thinking about strategy. But it's like today in the data, when you look at the most successful company, it's just not true.
Great. Thank you. Juan Fernando, please.
Thanks. Thanks for this, for increasing our willingness to have a simpler strategy.
You're very welcome.
And, okay, yeah. And I would like to ask about, how do you see that ESG issues will influence the characteristics of willingness to pay or sell in the future?
Such an interesting question. And I have actually done a little bit of research in this arena. So let me give you like the big message. On the willingness to pay of customer side, there's almost no evidence that customers are willing to pay higher prices if you meet ESG criteria. There are famous exceptions. Patagonia is like a company that comes to mind. Many of the things that they do are so part and parcel of their product that this kind of sustainability goes hand in hand with their brand. And then that led to increases in willingness to pay. But generally speaking, across many, many companies, we don't see an increase in willingness to pay. we do see an amazing decrease in willingness to sell. So think of ESG as a question of attracting talent. I see this, our MBA students today, if you have a terrible ESG record, they're just not interested. They're just not willing to work for your company. And so there, I would say two things. The first thing is pursuing these kinds of initiatives will definitely give you an advantage in the market for talent. And the advantage will be biggest with younger generations of employees. You want to very carefully think about whether that position is consistent with your overall strategy. And I give you one famous example. You remember Google in the beginning, don't do evil? So that was basically the way they attracted employees. And then, 10 years later, you have contracts with the Department of Defense. You're working for the Chinese government, essentially doing surveillance work in Xinjiang. And basically your employees' stature have evolved. This is not what we signed up for. And so what you want to think about is ESG is really effective at driving down willingness to sell. You're creating value for your employees, but you want to think about, is it consistent with how you want to compete? So I worked recently with a really large bank that was thinking about climate change. And they decided they wanted to be in the middle of the pack of financial services institutions. They wanted to take climate change really seriously, but don't be a leader. Why did they want to be a leader? They feared that by being a leader in climate change, that they would attract many, many super green employees where this is their most important concern. And that they felt would probably limit the business that they could do every now and then. And so they decided to take it seriously, to make investments, but not to be leading. And I think that's the right way to think about it. Don't think about it as an advantage in willingness to pay. It's an advantage in willingness to sell. And then I think the last point that I would like to make is, you know how we talk about purpose now all the time? And I think it's a good thing. And purpose also, not so much evidence that it helps with willingness to pay. Purpose really helps with willingness to sell. But there's sort of two kinds of purpose. One purpose is for the company as a whole. And this is when we talk in board conversations, we're thinking about what's the purpose of the organization. But there's also something purpose at the level of each individual. And you see the difference when you look at data for nurses. Nurses will typically say, oh, my hospital, the purpose of my hospital, amazing. This is why I became a nurse in the first place. It's really the job that I want to do. But like my everyday job, how much do I feel like I have good purpose? Not so much. I'm like a chicken without a head. I'm run from patient to patient. I barely have time for conversations. And so I think what you want to think about is you can drive down willingness to sell, but I think it's most effective if you do it in the everyday experience of people who work for your organization. The board conversation is nice to have, it makes for a nice opening for your annual report, but it's not that meaningful for individuals. For individuals, what really matters is, do you create value for myself day to day? Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to a simple question.
Thanks. Very
maybe
insightful.
we have maybe time for one more quick question. Carlos Enrique, I think you had raised your hand.
Yes, thank you, Felix. It's been a pleasure and reading your book and hearing your talk. So it's complements very well. Could you expand a little bit more on the 5 ask how? Because you gave the example of the 2 bags, but conceptually, what is it they ask how?
Yes. Yeah. So conceptually is I bring an idea to you and I say, do this and this and this, and then that would increase willingness to pay. Or do this and this and this and this, and that would decrease willingness to sell. And then you're going to ask me, what's the mechanism? How exactly does that work? And so I would tell you, my idea is I raise willingness to pay with the help of a brand. And you ask, okay, so why exactly, how is it that consumers are going to pay a higher price if you have a brand? And you're telling me, well, we're in the market for pharmaceuticals. people are always a little unsure about what's the quality of medication. And as a result, if you have a really good brand, that gets to you to premium prices. And the example would be Bayer sells aspirin at roughly twice the price of the private label product. It's exactly the same product. There's no difference. And we've known for 100 years what aspirin is. And yet people have much higher willingness to pay. Why? Because there's just this tiny bit of uncertainty about the quality of the product. And if I'm uncertain about the quality of the product, the brand is really like a fabulous crutch to help me gain confidence. Or if I come to you and I say, I raise willingness to pay with the help of network effects. And you're asking me, how exactly is it going to work? How is it that people, if I have more adoption of my product, willingness to pay for the product will go up? And I tell you, well, our product is electric cars. If lots of people have electric cars, then we will have many more charging stations. If we have many more charging stations, willingness to pay for electric cars is going to go up. You want to understand the mechanism that leads to these changes in willingness to pay or willingness to sell. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. This is great. I think we unfortunately ran out of time. We can stay here forever because it's super interesting. But in the interest of time, I'll pass it on to Guillermo for to wrap it up. But thanks a million for spending time with the Columbia,
of course, my
MIT
pleasure.
Harvard Club.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks a lot, Professor Oberholzer. As general conclusions, I will mention the convenience of developing simpler strategies and also putting value creation at the center of our actions, and either or in our organizations or in our daily lives. And I think this is a very important conclusion in these times in which we will have all to contribute to economic recovery in our country. So thanks a lot. I will end the event by saying thanks to Lucas for the coordination and moderation of this event, and many thanks to Professor Oberholzer for being with us and for your very interesting presentation. Thanks also to all of you for being with us this afternoon, and we invite you to continue participating in the next events of our club. So that's all, and good afternoon. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All the best.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.